Welcome back, Visions fans. Ready Player Will here with part 2 of the Summer Jayden character review. Very quickly, going over what we're going to talk about today is going to be the class and job analysis, the two potential builds that I think are really going to work well for him, one more so than the other, but one at least brings some visibility to the second, some AI and auto prioritization in terms of what to expect ability-wise, the TMR review, where it fits into the game, and then my general thoughts now that we've had a chance to look at his stats in part 1 and all of these abilities in part 2. And now a lot of this is going to be conceptual, where I'm going to really dive into the numbers, the nitty-gritty, the strategies in part 3. So just recapping, part 1, for those of you who have missed it, it's the character overview, the base and total stat analysis, a quick Jayden comparison, and a reminder upon what the dexterity stat can really do for you, in addition to the report card, which is a great overview of the character. Part 3, which is coming very, very soon, is going to be a breakdown on AP management, because there is a unique characteristic about him, which we'll talk about in a second. And then the Esper, weapon, vision card, and trust stone synergies and optimizations, which there's actually a handful that you really have to become well versed in to know where it's most appropriate to use in certain situations, whether that be maps and metas and matchups, things of that nature. So part 3 is one that I'm very much excited for. Without waiting any longer though, let's get into the class and job overview. So passive ability wise, for those of you that recall from the report card, he's got 3 really good ones here. And unfortunately, you can only equip 2. And you're going to have to make some major trade-offs potentially between them. So just going through a couple that I think are not going to get much use. It's going to be height 3 and height 2, and level 4 to level 3. Those are the arithmetician passives. Those may be niche for PvE content, maybe niche for some PvP matchups. You will not be using those in the vast majority of instances. Knowledge reserves, also one you're probably never going to use. The cast time is not a big enough part of his kit to really have to use. For those of you that want a reminder on why this is still a good passive, just not for him, feel free to check out Dark Fiend, a part 3 review. I did a whole casting breakdown there. I'll leave the comment below as well, just for those of you that might have missed it. But the 3 that are really great here, number 1 is customized parts, increased range of 2. Now, what's really interesting about Jayden as a missile user is that he's got no access to range +1. Not in the passives, he's got no buff for it, nothing at all. So it's either 2 or nothing, which actually has some dramatic changes on how he actually works in the battle. So you have some big decisions to make when it comes to which passives you equip. So customized parts is probably one of his best ones, though. The second one, which is to me a must, 100% of the time, I literally don't know how you can use his character without it, is the Ruler's Resolve, the magic buff of 24%, spear penetration of 40%, and decreased AP consumption of 20%. All 3 of those things are really vital to keeping him competitive with the top level of the game. So that's an absolute must, in my opinion. And then finally, the third one, which is good but debatable, is Scholarly Intuition, where it gives him defense of 12 to increase his bulkiness a little bit, while also giving a very valuable accuracy of 20%, which allows you to have some extra flexibility in his builds. All 3 of these are good and necessary at different times, obviously. Now, Scholarly Intuition, maybe you just use it for the defense. I think that's a certainly viable reason why. Or maybe you want it for the accuracy for evasion metas. Customized parts, obviously, you want for certain maps to keep them out of harm's way. I'm going to get a little more into that in the double build section here. But for now, good passives, but you really do have some difficult decisions to make. Now, from the counter abilities perspective, these are good, if not below average, quite honestly, counter abilities. So the King goes first. The top one here is probably his best one overall, where it does have a nice range of 4, upwards of 6 if you have the passive on, range height of 2, where it is preemptive damage, so he'll damage the enemy before they hit him. The only downside with this ability, though, is that it is a direct line of sight firing ability, which means if you have a teammate directly in your line of sight of the enemy who's attacking you, you'll actually shoot your teammate in the back of the head if they're in the way. So there is a downside to that. Damage distribution is probably my second favorite one here. I think 20% is just a smidge low to rely on for survivability, and although it's nice that he'll recover some damage, I don't really think that's what he needs per se, so much as the King's goes first is a nice like offensive ability. And reactive force I just think is too short range and doesn't do enough compared to the King goes first. So overall, not in a good spot for counter abilities, but there's some debate where you might find your favorites. Now, when we get into the main job here, and I want to address this very quickly, there's an AP observation to be made, which is why I have a whole section on it in part 3. He only gets 18% of his starting AP, which is kind of weird as a magic scaling unit. Most magic scaling units start off with 50%, or at least something higher than the 18%. That's what most physical damage dealers get for starting AP. But if you're just doing like a general comparison, Elena gets 50% of her starting AP, Ibarra does, Queen gets up to 74%. So the fact that Jayden starts at only 18% actually has some things to consider when you talk about skill usage and AP management. Now, at the main job, we're going to go over the buffs here first, and then I'm going to go through the offensive abilities. So he's got 2 buffs here, amazingly named. Can't Beat the Heat is the first one. That's a magic buff of 40% and a spirit penetration buff of 40 to himself. This one doesn't get used as often as you might think, though we'll talk about why in the AI prioritization section soon. But Sun's Out, Guns Out, another great name. This is his main buff. It's generally actually a really good one. Increases agility of 25% to himself and allies, and also grants himself the AP restoration of 5%, which we're going to talk about more in part 3. It's got an AoE height of 1, which is nice and forgiving that you don't have to be exactly on flat land. But this is definitely the buff that he opens with, and we'll talk about that more in just a second as well. Both of these overall good buffs. Now, when it comes to the offensive abilities, there's a couple things to critically understand about how these work. And I'm just going to bring up the heights and ranges here. So AP Break Shot is a really good 15 AP ability that also decreases the enemy AP by 15. Some little nice utility there. Midsummer Sniper is really the best ability in his kit, though. This one is not only 100% hit chance, which is great in a variety of situations, but it also dispels all buffs and dispels haste for the target. That can't be understated how important that is. Quite honestly, that's what makes this ability the most important thing in his kit. The biggest part of his utility is to dispel buffs on enemies, and that includes things like tank hate, buffs of increasing magic or increasing spirit, elemental resistance buffs. All of those things can get dispelled, which is crucially important. But one thing that's unique about both of these abilities, which is why I have the 2 boxes around them, is that they are 2 abilities that require direct line of sight on the enemy, and they're only range height of 1. So they're a little limited in the trajectory and the angle that you can shoot at. So we're going to talk again in these builds in a second where this has some downsides, but it's definitely something to keep in mind. Now, Splash Shower is a good ability. It's a pretty wide AoE, got some nice range height there, decreases the counter chance of 100% for 3 turns to all targets there. It is a whopping 40 AP though, which is expensive considering that he doesn't start off with as much. And Maelstrom Jet is also another very good one in that it's got that flexibility of the range height 4, it's got some parabolic arc to it, so it's got some trajectory, 200% modifier is tied for the highest in his kit, and the decreasing healing power of 50, don't understate that. That actually is very large. Now, it's only single target as opposed to AoE, but when you're going against characters that have external heals or a giant self-heal or a regen, whatever it may be, 50% is actually very material in how much HP they'll recover. And the last thing to notice, for anyone that might have seen here, these are all instacast abilities, but they are also all reflectable, which means they are Celeste runicable. So she is very much a hard counter to Summer Jayden like she is to regular Jayden. And speaking quite frankly, I'm going to talk about this in the end in general thoughts. The biggest things to Jayden are these 2 pieces of utility here in dispelling the buffs and decreasing the healing power. If you don't get enough value from that 2 pieces of utility, Summer Jayden's probably not the best win unit to choose in your comp. Now, these are 2 very valuable pieces of utility for a majority of instances in the game, but if you're not using them, strictly speaking, damage and survivability wise, there's probably other better win units that you can substitute in. Now, when we get into the SubJob of the Beachside Stag, I actually like this one a lot. Now, again, both of these are instacast and runic shieldable, but Silencing Shot is another very nice status effect in his kit, where it also pairs well with More the Merrier, who also has a silencing effect. Jayden, as we'll see, has slow on his limit break, so it's nice that he has access to 2 status effects that can do relatively well. The Piercing Ray ability here, though, is a very, very good one for 2 reasons. Number 1, it's got piercing on it, and just a gentle reminder of what that means. It means that this is a unit ability, so it'll target their unit resistance, but technically if there's someone in the way of the shot, be it an enemy, the enemy will also get hit on the way to hitting your intended target. So it can also act as an AoE ability, which is kind of nice. But the best thing about Piercing Ray, you might have noticed, he can attack in any square adjacent to him. All the rest of these trajectory-based abilities, he can't shoot within 2 squares of himself, but this one you can. So it's very flexible when it comes to getting closer to enemies or weird map setups where Piercing Ray has some flexibility to how he can use it. Overall, this is actually a really good SubJob. I'll talk in a minute of where I think each one is best. I think this is probably best for things like duels and PvE content, maybe not in PvP and Guild Wars. For that, I think the Arithmetician is probably the best one, because when you talk about strategically positioning yourself in Guild Wars to have multiple attacks to try to get 6 stars or multiple defense, you typically, at least in this state of the game, want some kind of restorative, curative, sustainable, whatever you want to call it, abilities, and Jayden with the Arithmetician will do that. He will heal up low health teammates at, say, the start of a second attack or a second defend, which is a great amount of value. Now, obviously, in addition to the curative potential, he will not use it actively in battle if there's enemies in range. We'll talk about that more in a second. But just the flexibility of having magic type attacks on the SubJob paired with missile type attacks on the main job job, is nice that he has 2 to pick from, so he can potentially attack two different enemy weaknesses. Now, as we've seen, he doesn't have any magic attack up modifiers innately in his kit. He has a relatively below average magic stat, which doesn't matter for the missile type attacks, but for the magic type attacks, he's not going to do as much damage with these. So although it's nice to have to round out his damage a little bit, I would not rely on this as a pure damage dealing perspective, nor do I think it really gives him anything special in terms of range either, where he's already got some pretty good range on the main job. It's just nice that this has another opportunity to hit different heights, which we saw he's a little limited to in the main job in some instances. So the fact that you can get some height-based arrow and level 3 Aurora here, have some nice height capabilities, that's some nice flexibility for his kit. So I do like this one for Guild Wars and for, in general, a lot of content as well. But what that brings us to the final job here, Scholar. Now this one, there's really only 2 upsides that I see for Scholar. I don't think Law of Disarmament and Magic Orb are any abilities that you ever really want him using. Number 1, they're too short range. Number 2, they have cast times. Number 3, the modifiers are decent and not decent. And then Law of Speed Reading, I don't think you ever really need to use because he has no activation abilities other than these 2. So I think those 3 you can kind of throw in the trash. But the 2 that I do like, actually, Law of Preservation is a very nice one that gives him 15 defense and it allows him to not have his defense broken at all for 3 turns, in addition to not having his element resistance broken for 3 turns as well. This is one of the recent buffs that was given to Global as an overhaul of the Scholar job. But Law of Geo-Absorption, although this one does have the cast time, it's non-runic shieldable. So if you are seeing a Celeste, and the instance you are using him, this actually is a nice thing to use in that he can obviously do damage to her from afar, over an AoE, recover some health, have some strike type damage, not have it be absorbed. So that's pretty cool. So Scholar Job does have a time and place, just a little more strategic in how you use it. Which finally brings us to the limit break here, where this is a really good one. AoE 49 AP, maybe a smidge expensive considering what his AP levels are, but it's really not that bad. But it's got the 67% chance to inflict slow for 3 turns to enemies. This is a really important ability in terms of messing up the turn order and making sure that Jayden and your team can get a few extra hits in. So overall, I do like this ability a lot. As a limit break, your teammates will obviously capitalize on this as well if the enemy is slowed. Which brings us to the final little piece of his kit, the Mastery ability. HP 10%, Wind Attack 15. This is where he gets the 20% missile attack resistance penetration and kind of a random 5 missile attack. I don't think that's all that material. I'm almost puzzled why they even put it there in the first place. I would imagine it might be to help skew his damage threshold more toward missile than magic in certain instances, but it's pretty small. So now let's get into the 2 potential builds. Now the one that you're going to use in, I'm going to put a percentage, 75% of the time, 80% of the time, we're going to call it the sniper build. That's really what he's meant to do. But Wind is a little special and unique in the current state of the game, where I do think there's a close combat physical build for him, kind of surprisingly as well. And I'll get into both intricacies of both in a second. So the first one, that sniper build, you absolutely need the range +2 passive on. That's a given. For me, this is where flatter, and some more squarish maps really come to shine, where obviously where he's a little height limited sometimes, if it's flatter, he won't run into that problem, and where some of them require direct line of sight to be shooting, if you have a square and you're all kind of like evenly spread out, it gives him some more opportunities to take some off angles to ensure that he can properly maintain that line of sight. And you can obviously lean a little more into the arithmetician here too, where enemies tend to group up a little easier and get into some more AoE damage potential. And although he does have it on his main job, if you recall, it's 40 AP as opposed to, I think it's like the 18 AP that it costs for Arithmetician's Aurora. So way more economical there from the AoE perspective. Now the second one, where definitely more niche, but I'm not going to say never. Close combat physical is where you're going to want to have the Scholarly Intuition passive on, which gives him the extra defense. And you're probably going to want the Scholar sub on here as well for the Law of Preservation, which is the increase to the defense, not allow his defense to be broken, not allow the element in peril. And this is where you want to lean more into the Wind AoE synergy that Sodali primarily brings. More the merrier, does a little bit with her defense and spirit buff, but Sodali's really the one who does it with the 20% AoE resistance and the 20% elemental resistance that he can give to teammates. So if you can, again, kind of get your Wind team to move cohesively like that and put Jayden in the middle there, this to me is more optimal for very choke heavy, like longer rectangular maps. And the reason being, if you have like a very strong choke point, and by the nature of them being rectangular, people are going to like line up a little easier than some of the larger square arena maps where you can kind of go different directions. So these are definitely matchup and map specific. Now, when we get into the AI and auto prioritization, a couple things to keep in mind. He has a DPS AI, meaning he will always prioritize attacking an enemy in range instead of buffing or healing always. That's a given. These abilities that I'm about to go over are the same priority, whether or not there's a teammate nearby or not. And then finally, the Arithmetician subjob will heal a low ally teammate first before any of these buffs. So I have these listed in priority order of what he likes to do. So I have Suns Out, Guns Out. That's the one he spams primarily. It's that cross-shaped AoE that increases the agility. This is also one that he will spam multiple times if a teammate suddenly enters his range, even though he might have used it once on himself or a teammate. So you got to be really careful about the timing of how your team intersects. But secondly, he'll actually prioritize his TMR. Now, when I do these tests, I always use the character's own TMR. There might be some TMRs where he puts first above Suns Out, Guns Out. I haven't seen it yet, but it's pretty interesting and at least kind of nice to know that his TMR takes second priority here, with the third priority being Can't Beat This Heat, which is the magic buff and the spear penetration. Now, in all the tests I've done so far in limited Guild Wars and Arena, it is actually kind of hard to get this third one off, where typically he'll use Suns Out, Guns Out once or twice, and then if you have a TMR, he'll use that. So by the time he gets to the third one, people are usually already in range. So this one's actually not as reliable as you might think unless you specifically tailor your AI to it. But then when you put on the Scholar subjob, there actually is some abilities that supersede that. Law of Preservation actually comes third here, which is why I like that second build potentially, that when it comes to AI prioritization, he'll use Suns Out, Guns Out, maybe the TMR if you have it on or off, and then Law of Preservation actually supersedes Can't Beat This Heat for prioritization, with finally this useless Law of Speed Reading ability. So it is kind of interesting to note that Law of Preservation does have a priority above Can't Beat This Heat. You definitely want to keep that in mind if you're relying on 40 Spirit Penetration for whatever reason. Now, when we get into the TMR analysis, this is an interesting one. Number one, I like it's an accessory. The best thing about this, though, and although it's got good stats, 32 magic is nice for PvE content when you're maxing magic stats. 10 accuracy, 12 crit rate certainly helps round out some basic things. But more than anything, it's got two uses, which nowadays is a big premium, particularly for Guild Wars, which means you can effectively ensure the AI to be the same in Fight 1 as it will be in Fight 2. That's very important for the consistency and quality of your wins, and hopefully not your losses. But that's really nice. The second thing here, I actually think this ability might be overkill for Jayden himself. And the reason why I say that, although he's got a semi-below average base magic stat, that means the 40% magic buff, although nice, isn't going to like elevate him to any kind of crazy levels. But number two, he already does have a magic buff technically in his kit. Now, although TMR supersedes it, if you just didn't equip this and had TMR turned off, he would use magic buff second anyway. So the magic buff is almost redundant, and the missile attack resistance penetration of 20, in my opinion, is actually almost overkill for him, given that what he has innately on the mastery ability, what he has on the vision card, which we haven't talked about yet, and then what he has externally on Truststone passives or the diamond coat. To me, this TMR is really for enabling the teammates, that if you're in a group with Sadali or more who have magic scaling abilities, that have magic missile abilities, that by giving them 40% magic, and they do have very high magic values, in addition to missile attack resistance penetration for them, you greatly increase their damage output. So I do like this TMR from that perspective. Maybe not for Jayden himself, but at least when you're talking about that win synergy. And the only downside here, I also think it's good for regular Jayden, where regular Jayden obviously has some great magic as well, has no innate missile resistance penetration, so this is nice for regular light Jayden, but it's limiting in that it's the magic 40% buff. So there's only a handful of missile units that have magic scaling abilities, and so this is going to be confined to them for the most part. Obviously, you could use this on regular missile users where they're going to get that 20% penetration, but I really don't think that's useful in a majority of instances, at least when it comes to picking the priority of your abilities. Which brings us now finally to the general thoughts. So to me, he's another unique, or maybe not unique at this point, magic scaling missile unit that is kind of a common thing, particularly with Sadali and more, as we've mentioned in the Windcast. But he does have great utility to dispel buffs and haste to target, reduce the counter chance 100% AoE to a group, decrease the healing power of 50, and an AoE slow status effect. All of those things together are very valuable, but you have to remember, if you're not getting value out of the dispel buff and the healing power down, Jayden's value very much goes down, and that's the case for all utility-driven characters. If you're not getting full utility out of what they bring, it's really not enough to trade off for the on average less damage they do compared to other damage dealers, or for characters that have better utility than them. So you have to keep that in mind strategically. He does have versatility to have magic attack types in the SubJob, which I like a lot. He is limited by height in many situations because, again, the Dispel ability being range height 1, and even his 15 AP, his cheapest ability being range height 1, can be a little limiting, where you usually rely on those abilities as the fight goes on, when you start running out of AP. So the fact that he has to be in a specific position can be kind of difficult, but still largely counterable by Celeste. Law of Geoabsorption is the only real way around this, but otherwise, I think he actually has really good tank busting potential, at least from the missile perspective, definitely to the Spirit penetration perspective as well, where he gets 40 from the passive and 20 from his weapon, so 60, like all times non-dispellable, and he can get obviously up to 100% if he applies his own buff as well, which is kind of nuts to have that 100% Spirit penetration. That's an amazing threshold, but he also does have 30 to 40 missile resistance penetration in his base form between his mastery ability and what you can give to him for a Diamond Cloak or Truststone passive, but he can get up to 75% as well when you consider the vision card. So when you're talking about really high missile resistance tanks, which are actually kind of few and far between, so I might be hyping this up a little bit, but you really don't see very high missile resist in practice, but he at least has the potential that he can penetrate the majority of it, so that's really good from that perspective. But finally, as I just mentioned, not huge value outside of the Dispel and Healing Power down. There's a variety of other wind units that overlap in this like magic scaling missile range kind of build. So to the extent I gave him the B+ rating in the report card, I think that's fair, because he's great, but he's not game-changing. He's going to benefit largely by what wind already does. He's just a really nice, strong unit to add into there for some specific matchups and certain maps to abuse. But that's the Summer Jayden review part 2 in a nutshell. Hopefully this was informative. Very much excited, looking forward to part 3, as you can probably tell by how much I keep talking about it, where we really get to look at what you can do for external equips, just how good his weapon does and what it allows you to customize for. There's actually a lot of vision card synergies, which everyone assumes you just use the Jayden vision card. That's kind of niche in certain situations, though. You're not going to always want to use that, so there's a lot to go over. Very much excited to do so, and that should be coming relatively soon. But for now, thank you for watching. As always, comments, criticisms, corrections, critiques in the comment section below. Happy to interact with you all, and I will talk to you all soon.